Started, we have a lot to cover today. I am Claudia Garcia Grasso, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the San Diego Domestic Violence Council. And we are headed to October, and those of you that have been with us for quite a while know what that means. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and as you know, we cover the county, bringing awareness, helping victims and survivors. Of course, we do that all year long, but it's a concerted effort in October to remember all of those who we've lost, and also to come together as a community to basically cover the county with resources, with support, with encouragement, and basically shout the accolades that all of you are reaching and achieving every day in your efforts. So our opening event, we are starting with the planning, and it will take place on Thursday, October 7th. That will be at noon. And we will once again go virtual for our opening event. These times are still uncertain. We want to make sure that everyone is comfortable with joining. And so we made that tough call of going virtual. And then hopefully in 2022, we'll be back in a venue with all of us together. So with that, also shout out to all our regions. As you know, we also have regional events throughout October. And so I know that our East, our North, I'm sure our South are starting with the planning to bring to you just an amazing October. Also, in October, we will not have a general meeting to give you the opportunity to join in on all the celebration that we have going on for the month. So just to, FYI for your planning. Now, I'm going to turn it over to today. Today, we will be talking about stalking. And this is a crucial topic, and it's very much interwoven with domestic violence, as you know, with domestic abuse. And I was looking at some statistics, and I believe I read somewhere 1 in 4 women in the United States are stalked at some point in their lifetime. That is a huge number. And again, it could be stalked. Today we are talking about an intimate partner relationship, but of course there's stalking with a stranger. There's different forms. But the 2 presenters we have today are experts. In essence, they are experts because not only do they lead the task force, and I don't know if you knew that we have a county-wide stalking task force, and they will tell you all about that. They lead that, but also they are in the trenches prosecuting these cases. So Ramona is a prosecutor, and Oz, as you'll find out, is a DA investigator. And so together they're the dream team, of course, and they are in the trenches and see these cases developing through the investigation piece, through the prosecution piece, also through the victim and survivor piece. And so they are privy to these perspectives, if you will, and are here to share with you what that looks like. So I start with Ramona McCarthy. As I said, she's a deputy district attorney in our office in San Diego, and she's currently one of our supervisors in the Family Protection Division. And I've mentioned before, Family Protection, we prosecute cases of domestic violence, child abuse, both sexual and physical, elder abuse, and animal abuse. As a deputy district attorney, Ramona handles some of the most heinous crimes in the DA's office, including child torture, child molest, domestic violence, and of course, stalking and other related and homicides. She prosecutes these offenders not only to seek justice, but to also empower the survivors of these crimes and help them realize that they are resilient and can accomplish anything and move forward with their lives. She works side by side with DAI Oz Cruz on the Stalking Homicide Prevention Task Force, helping law enforcement and prosecutors countywide identifying and investigating stalking cases with safety planning with stalking victims. She is also legal writing instructor. She is the program director for our court dog program services, and she's an adjunct professor at Cal Western School of Law. Oz Cruz, who is the other tag team partner in this dream team, began his career with law enforcement, first with the Sheriff's Department and then with Chula Vista, where he worked for 16 years in patrol, K-9, family protection unit, but also worked robbery, homicide, and gangs. During his first rotation in the Family Protection Unit, he gained experience in domestic violence cases. When he went back to patrol and realized that these investigations could be handled differently by patrol, he spent the next years developing a new concept of handling domestic violence calls and created the Domestic Violence Response Team, or DART. This project was funded by a grant, which allowed police department to create this project to impact the community. This team was a success. And after critical evaluation, both by Chula Vista Police Department and a third-party researcher, it was concluded that this program that he spearheaded at Chula Vista PD reduced domestic violence by 24%. It just unheard of, unbelievable. The project went on to win a prestigious international award, the Hermann Goldstein Award, in 2018. Oz Cruz has now been with the DA's office for 6 years, and his role is to help our office in the investigation and prosecution of child abuse cases, including domestic violence. He has great experience working with stalking victims and stalking cases, and he is the lead investigator on the Stalking Homicide Prevention Team, and they can tell you a little bit about what that is. So I hand you over to our Stalking Dream Team, Ramona McCarthy and Oz Cruz.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Oh, great. And can you guys see our screen?
Yes.
Great. And we will reveal our faces at the end of this training. And we'll also be answering any questions that you have at the end of this training as well. Thank you for joining us. This voice you're hearing, I'm Ramona McCarthy.
Oz Cruz.
And we are here to talk to you about stalking. As Claudia had mentioned, it's a very important topic that's absolutely interwoven with domestic abuse. Now, our game plan for today is to talk to you about stalkers and stalking law. We will then talk to you about tried and true tactics for stalking investigations. And lastly, we will talk to you about another very important topic, which is victim safety planning.
And also, just to start off, we'll be covering all these topics, but this presentation really is to cover the legal elements needed for stalking. The best way to explain what is needed or elements of a crime is to think of elements as ingredients within a recipe. I use this analogy quite a bit. If you want to make chocolate chip cookies, you need chocolate chips. Otherwise, you don't have chocolate chip cookies. So think of elements as those needed ingredients that are needed, required in order to complete that crime. And we'll be covering those elements for stalking today.
And Oz, I'm so sorry to interrupt. If you can speak up just a little bit to make sure we can hear Ramona fine, but you kind of come in and out. So make sure that you speak loudly enough. And also, I'm so sorry, I forgot to say, please sign in on the chat box. There is a link. If you will sign in for this presentation today. And also, if you have any questions for Ramona or Oz at any point, please type them into the chat box and then we can share with them afterwards. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
No worries. So moving on, wanted to talk to you before we move into discussing stalkers and stalking law. And Claudia talked about this a little bit in her introduction, but the statistics behind stalking. Claudia mentioned about 1 in 4 women, which is even more alarming. The last that we had pulled, which was earlier this year, was about 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men have experienced stalking in their lifetime, which is just alarming numbers. So in that, another important thing to note is that stalking begins early. Earlier this year, we had presented to a group of teenagers and young adults to talk about stalking. And the reason for that is because stalking statistically starts fairly early for these victims. About 54% of female victims and 41% of male victims experienced stalking or stalked before they were even 25 years old. So again, it happens early on in these people's lives. Another alarming statistic is that about 50% of our intimate partner murders, these are our domestic violence related homicides, were preceded by stalking behavior. So again, it's something that our office takes very seriously. Now, in speaking of stalking and you know what stalking is, and Oz and I will discuss the laws behind stalking in a moment, but you know, you hear stalking and there's different types of stalking. Now, there's stalking where there is no prior relationship between the stalker and the stalking victim. Many times we see just, you know, a random stranger who just gets fixated on their victim after they run into him, you know, multiple times at a coffee shop, for example, just zero relationship, but for whatever reason, the stalker becomes fixated on this person. In the non-domestic violence context, we also see stalking many times between people who have a relationship and not a former romantic relationship. This, for example, could be a therapist patient, for example. We've seen those as well. And, you know, our office prosecutes stalking when people have no prior relationship or no prior dating relationship. But here in the Family Protection Division, the division that Oz and I are in, we handle stalking cases where there was some type of prior romantic relationship between the stalker and the stalkee. And in fact, that is the most common type of stalker that we see here. And the term that they've titled it is called the rejected lover stalking. And again, this is usually when there is, or this is when there is a prior relationship, a prior romantic relationship between the stalker and the stalkee. And usually this happens once the victim is finally ready to leave the relationship, whether be it there was prior domestic violence in that relationship, or the victim just started seeing those red flags and realized it's time to get out of this. That is usually when the stalking gets triggered. The stalker just can't let that victim go, becomes fixated on that victim, and will do all that he or she can to let the victim know that I'm in charge and I still control you. Now, I put a quote in there that you can see on the slide. It's from a stalking victim, and it says, "I was too scared to leave and too scared to stay." And I think that quote's is important because it really captures the struggles in a in a stalking case where the victim has had this prior relationship, is scared of their stalker, but sometimes they may go back with that stalker just because they know that if they go back into that relationship, at least the stalker is satisfied and they pose less of a danger to that victim, or at least so that victim thinks. The rejected lover stalking is extremely convoluted, just like domestic violence relationships become very convoluted. So yeah, I thought that quote is very powerful.
And I agree. We see something similar to that, or those statements quite a bit as we begin to speak and communicate more with our victims in these cases. Because the numbers are so great in regards to the individuals that are victims of stalking, the likelihood of any of us having friends, family members, or people that we know that are victims of stalking, is the potential there is great. So something to keep in mind is these statements. These are the red flags that we look for. If we have an individual that remains in a relationship and doesn't leave the relationship, that may be because the person is just too scared to leave. And so when you hear these things, these should be red flags for those friends and families to provide some assistance and bring light to the actual stalking that's continuing.
So our role here as prosecutors and part of the law enforcement team and working closely with our law enforcement partners is to recognize a potential stalking case, to investigate this potential stalking case, and to evaluate whether we should move forward and prosecute the stalking case.
We also find that many times it does not meet the criteria or the elements of stalking. Nevertheless, our office wants to assist those that are being harassed and want to provide some guidance. Sometimes it's on that fine line. And so at our office, Ramona and I do reach out to those victims, contact those victims, and try to offer some advice. We also assist with safety plans. And even if we do not take on the case because it does not meet the criteria needed or required by law, there are still additional resources, victim services, and so we do connect them with our services available.
So now we want to talk about the stalking laws. And, you know, here in California, we're just going to focus on stalking laws here in California. And that is governed by Penal Code Section 646.9. Now, that penal code section governs stalking. There is a subsection within that code that for stalking while there was a restraining order in place. And then I also included restraining order violations. That is governed by Penal Code Sections 166 and 273.6. And the reason why I also included the restraining order violations is because a lot of times many stalking cases are disguised within those restraining order violations. And we'll talk about that in a moment. For now.
And just to touch base, I know sometimes there's some confusion in regards to the restraining orders. One is through the criminal courts once a case has been filed, and the other one is more through family court, where the victim, and I'll say herself because of the statistics, we have more female victims, but the victim herself may go to family court and request a restraining order to be served to the individual without a criminal case actually taking place.
That's a great point. And if you look at the numbers that are on your slide, the 166, and there's various subsections to that, but I won't go too far into the weeds on that. But the 166 generally governs the orders that were given by a criminal court. And the 273.6 are restraining orders that were granted by a family court. or civil court. So we talk a lot about stalking, and you know, many of us who are not in law enforcement or who are not prosecutors have an idea of what stalking is. You know, there's lots of movies, there's TV shows, there's just our common sense, you know, definition of what stalking is, and victims, they'll naturally use the word "I'm being stalked." There is that, and that's just kind of common sense of what you assume stalking is. But under the law in California, Penal Code Section 646.9, it is very specific and defines what stalking is. And as prosecutors, what we have to prove to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt is the following. Oz, at the beginning of our training, talked to you about elements, equating that to ingredients, you know, and you need all the ingredients. For example, you know, baking chocolate chip cookies, you're going to need those chocolate chips. Well, here we have to prove these elements beyond a reasonable doubt to prove that this person is guilty of committing stalking. And the first element is that the stalker, and I'm paraphrasing here, this is not exactly verbatim, you know, they don't say stalker, it says the defendant. So paraphrasing here, but the stalker willfully and maliciously harassed or willfully and maliciously repeatedly followed the stalking victim, and the stalker made a credible threat with the intent to place the victim in reasonable fear for his or her safety or the safety of his or her family.
And with that, please keep in mind number 2. We'll go back to number 2 towards the end of this presentation. And this is the most difficult part to prove in court, and what is the biggest hurdle for us here at the DA's office. But again, we'll touch base on this again towards the end.
Yes, and you know, and that's absolutely important. I think that element number 1, where this person was harassing you, repeatedly following you, I think that's the more kind of common sense, like accepted of like, yeah, that's what's stalking. But legally, we also have to prove that second element of credible threat. So I'm going to, and I won't spend too much time on this, but to understand these terms of art that were contained in those 2 elements that I read to you. And in the law, everything has a further legal definition. So when the stalker repeatedly harassed means to seriously annoy, alarm, torment, or terrorize this victim. And this stalker is doing so with no legitimate purpose. Course of conduct means 2 or more acts occurring over a period of time with continuity of purpose. So that period of time can be fairly short. Sometimes we can legally have stalking if all elements are met, even if it's just a matter of a couple of weeks, for example. Although probably from your experience or from working these cases, we know it's much longer than that. And repeatedly followed. Under the law, that means more than once. So thankfully, the law allows us to have a little bit more wiggle room when it comes to at least defining these legal terms. But as Oz mentioned, when he asked you to remember that second part that we have to prove, which is that credible threat. A credible threat under the law means that the stalker communicated to the victim something that causes that victim to reasonably fear for his or her safety, and it's something that was communicated that made the victim feel that the stalker was able to carry out that threat. Now, it doesn't mean that the stalker intends to carry out that threat, but just so long as it's reasonable to know that the stalker could if the stalker wanted to. Now, this credible threat can be made orally, it could be written, it could be electronic threat, via email or text message. It can be implied by a pattern of conduct that was exhibited by the stalker. Or it can be a combination of all of that. And in a lot of our cases, we get a combination where there could be a oral threat that was made or a text message that says, watch your back, I'm coming for you. And also implied by a pattern of conduct following the victim. And we'll go into it, kind of some examples that we've seen in a moment. But many times in our cases, many times when there isn't a direct threat made, we have to kind of dig deep to see if there's an implied threat by the pattern of conduct.
And during many of our investigations, by the time it gets to us and we start to evaluate it and speak to the law enforcement officers, be it the patrol officers or the investigators from those departments, what we tend to find is that after speaking to the victim, they tend to hear from the victim that they're not scared. They begin to minimize these things. And so what we must keep in mind is that these victims sometimes are living in a very violent and abusive relationship that has been normalized to them. And so what is normal to them in those particular relationships may not A, be legal or as to what's happening as far as abuse, but B, is not normal for what we consider to be a normal relationship without the abuse part. And so we have to keep that in mind when we're speaking to the individuals. What I find many times is that I will speak to the victim and I will hear things such as, I'm no longer scared. And I speak to them and they tell me, I look out the door and I'll check all my windows and the surrounding before I go out. Then I walk to the car that I've parked over a block away. And then when I leave, I'm constantly checking my rear view mirror to make sure that I'm not being followed, but I'm not scared. And so these actions have been taken by the individuals because this is their only way to feel safe, but they've changed their lifestyle. They've changed the way they are doing it because they are in fear. And so it is important for us to really dig deep, is what we continuously say to each other, is let's dig deep into these cases, into the lifestyle, into the relationship, so we have a better understanding as to what the normal relationship is to them versus what they believe they've been living.
And piggybacking among what Oz was saying is this exactly it, digging deep, we have to look at when we don't have a direct threat, we have to prove the second element in order to legally show that this person is legally stalking this victim. But they do everything, the stalker does everything short of making a direct threat. The stalker is harassing this victim, following, and through statistics, usually her, following her, but also stalkers can be men or female as well. Nonstop phone calls, following the victim, driving by the victim's workplace, driving by the victim's school, hanging out, down the street from the victim's home, just waiting for the victim to come home. All of those things that are just so scary and just disturbing behavior, yet short of that credible threat, because the stalker hasn't said, I'm going to kill you. The stalker hasn't even insinuated anything of sort. The victim left this relationship, but maybe it wasn't abusive. Maybe the victim left because, he or she started seeing the red flags, but it was just short of physical violence. There was emotional manipulation and power control issues, but not physical violence. So then Oz and I, and in working with our law enforcement partners, look to see, was there an implied threat? And as Oz was saying, we look into what was that relationship like? Why did you leave? Those red flags. Many times stalkers leave cryptic messages that only the person being stalked would understand, but someone like, me or anyone else looking at the case, it wouldn't mean much. Perhaps making a vague type of threat of watch your back, but then they're following the victim. Now we're starting to elevate more towards that implied threat to bring us to credible threat.
And in domestic violence, we continuously look for these cryptic messages. What I hear continuously when I hear victims is that he gave me that look. And many times law enforcement hears that and they bypass that. But it's important to kind of dig into that and dig deep into what does that mean? I hear this many times. He gave me that look. Well, what does that look mean? Well, I knew when I got that look that later this evening, I was going to be beat. Or statements as wait till we get home. Well, what does that mean to you? Well, every time he says that, this happens. So we look for these cryptic messages. Sometimes it can just be, it can be a simple little thing as an emoji being sent to their phone, or a reminder of a particular event or a location. Remember, XYZ, and that immediately sends a message of, this is going to happen to you. So we look for those cryptic messages, and those are very important.
Along the lines of, not always having this direct threat being made or this pattern of conduct that's disturbing but not illegal. It's a challenge that law enforcement officers face routinely. And that's the crime's not always obvious. It's not always obvious that, or there's just not a crime. If there's no restraining order, the stalker has every right to drive past the victim's workplace, right? That's not illegal. The stalker has every right to go on to the school campus that the victim goes to school. That's not illegal. It's not illegal to call a victim. I mean, it could become a misdemeanor crime. We have a crime of Penal Code Section 653M that governs harassing phone calls. So perhaps it could get elevated, but 3-4 calls a day, is that harassing? Maybe not. And so it becomes very frustrating. And, and that is a challenge that law enforcement has, is especially without that restraining order violation. What happens a lot, even if there is a restraining order, and the stalker shows up, many times by the time the victim dials 911 and the police arrive, the stalker's gone. There's no witnesses, no one to corroborate, that the stalker was there. And it becomes not only a challenge for law enforcement, but very, very hard on the victims, because nothing's being done.
And it's important to realize that frustration, and we'll get into the frustration a little bit later also, but restraining order violations, eventually what we see is that there's a gap in regards to the restraining orders being violated. And when we look into it, we realize that it hasn't stopped. They stopped reporting it because nothing was happening. They were reporting the violation to law enforcement, but by the time patrol officers arrived, the individual was gone. So therefore, it just becomes a report. Because it's a misdemeanor, officers aren't going out and looking for the individual to arrest them. Because it's a misdemeanor versus a felony, and even if the individual was there the next day, they wouldn't be able to arrest them based off of the category of that crime. So eventually that builds some frustration, and we start seeing that they just stop calling law enforcement. So a lapse of restraining order violations doesn't necessarily mean it stops. That's one thing to remember. And then within regards to the no witnesses and no corroboration, many victims are embarrassed in regards to what is happening in their life. They're embarrassed in regards to how they're having to change their lifestyle. And so not only do they begin to minimize it, they stop sharing this information with friends. And we find that when law enforcement is looking for witnesses or corroboration for that, there are no witnesses because they stopped sharing the information. But what we also find is as we begin to do a lot more digging in on our investigation is friends, family, and even neighbors are fully aware as to what's happening. They're just not being involved in it or not communicating with the victim themselves as to, I see this, but they're aware of it. So it is important to, just because the victim says, no, nobody else saw this, not to take it for face value and really do the work. And that's where my line comes into the investigation of really digging deep and looking for those additional witnesses. So that's all we have from there.
And again, along those same lines, as far as kind of digging in and looking for witnesses or, you know, realizing that there may be more to the story than what the victim's telling you is one good tool that we have, especially when victims do go and take the time to get that restraining order, which I'm sure many of you who are listening understand. If you haven't worked with a victim directly, at least many of you understand that it takes time. You know, you have to file the paperwork for the restraining order. Many times you need to seek some legal assistance because it's court paperwork and that's confusing. And then you have to take time off work to go to court and then go to a hearing. And in short, you know, it takes a lot for a victim to get to that point to say, enough is enough. I need a restraining order. And it's during that time in this enough is enough. I'm ready to take action. I'm ready to stand up for myself and take back some control. In order to get that restraining order, the victim has to complete an affidavit. And in that affidavit, the victim has to lay out why they're afraid of this person, why they need the law to intervene and to help this victim and have the stalker stop contacting them. And for a court to say, if you contact this victim, now that's a crime. And so you do have to, or many victims do, go into detail in their affidavits. And so as a great tool, especially when, because many times, you know, the victim, by the time a victim comes to us, to the DA's office, and even to a detective in law enforcement, they're frustrated and they've told this story and over, and they may not give it to you in total detail. So those affidavits, when pulling those affidavits, will likely have a lot of information and perhaps some more detail that the victim shared in writing and felt more comfortable in sharing in writing than they did verbally in a victim interview. Also in those affidavits, many of times the victim will talk about family members, friends, coworkers who are also witnesses to this type of stalking, harassing behavior. And through those affidavits, we may find a way to help prove the stalking case. And Oz and I have been touching upon this throughout the training, but you know, another stalking challenge, it's not just for law enforcement. And again, we've been weaving this and you've been hearing this, but it's very frustrating for stalking victims. And a lot of times by the time Oz and I get to meet a stalking victim, they are just, they're tired. They're frustrated. They feel broken down. We've had victims come to our meetings with multiple binders. You know, they've had to play the role of detective and saving, you know, and printing every text message, every email, taking screenshots and printing the multiple phone calls that, you know, from the stalker, saving voicemails, saving those onto CD or sending them to us. And they're tired, you know, they've called police over and over and nothing happens. And they're frustrated. And frankly, they have every right to feel frustrated, you know, and so by the time we meet them, they're tired, they're exhausted. And what we do in these interviews is do our best to make them feel heard and let them know that we're all on a team together, and we do take what has happened seriously, and we care about them, and we want to do everything we can to make this behavior stop.
And it's important to acknowledge that from the very beginning. Once we decide to take on a case, one of the things that I sit down and tell the victim is discuss that frustration, like Ramona said, that acknowledge that frustration, go over the frustration that they've been feeling and bring it to the surface and know and explain it verbally that we understand which that person has gone through and that frustration is there. And it's going to continue because there's a lot of work to do. But by doing so, we begin to build a team with the victim. And it's very important that we build a team and not that here's the case, do your best, and we go off and we do our work. We don't, that's just not how we handle these cases. We begin to build a team, a relationship with this victim in regards to what is happening, what's going to happen, and start digging into everything. So that is very important to start from the very beginning. Most victims don't hear that expressed from our side. When I say our side, I'm referring to law enforcement. They've contacted officers over and over. Sometimes it's a different patrol officer that comes out. I recall being at Chula Vista PD and coming in on a Monday. Maybe I was off on Monday, coming in on a Tuesday. And over the weekend, there's been 4 different restraining order violations, all taken by 4 different officers. So you can imagine the frustration of this victim wanting to be able to tell the same story or build upon that story, but instead they have to deal with a different patrol officer and explain everything over again. And then here I am on a Tuesday, and by the time I review it and read everything, it's now Friday when I'm giving this person a call. And most likely there's 2 more violations that have happened before I even get an opportunity to call that victim. So I acknowledge that frustration, and it's important for them to hear that and from all our sides.
So what we do, again, what Oz and I do on our team and in working closely with our law enforcement partners is we try our best to collect as much evidence as we can to help prove the stalking case. And again, like I said, some victims have all of the evidence with them and they'll just give it to you. They have binders of it. Some not as much. And so we will ask for it and we work together. As Oz said, we're a team with that victim and working together to see if we can build a stalking case that we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And so some of that evidence lies in text messages, emails, call logs showing, we'll have victims bring their phone and just scroll up and be like, look how many times this person calls me. Social media, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, those are very popular social media apps that stalkers use to contact their victims. Many times stalkers can't handle themselves and they will just leave voicemails, very angry, using lots of profanity. At those times, sometimes we get the threats that come out. We will get those in voicemails, and many victims save those. And audio recordings. One thing that we tell our victims is, you get a restraining order most of the time, unless the judge decides not to, but generally what happens in those restraining orders is you are, as a protected party of that restraining order, allowed to, under the law, record the restrained party. So the victim can record the stalker if there is a face-to-face meeting or the ability to actually record him that would not otherwise be illegal.
And also with that, it's important for law enforcement to tell the victim that not only are we going to accept just what the information that they're bringing to us, we're really going to dig into everything. And sometimes we find that as they are getting frustrated, they're replying back with anger, leave me alone. And they're using profanity. The victim themselves are using profanity and saying things that they're saying it out of anger just because they're at wit's end. And so sometimes they're worried in regards to presenting that information. We understand that type of reaction, but we have to explain it that everything comes in. We're not just picking and choosing. We just can't. Everything needs to come in.
Absolutely. And we tell them too, you know, don't be embarrassed. We're not judging you. You have every right to react. And we do our best to make them feel comfortable to share that information with us, because that goes back to why it's so frustrating for victims. Now they have to open up their whole private life to you. And it's so unfair, but unfortunately it's what we need to move forward to prove a stalking case. And in part of that, we had talked about social media a little bit, but, you know, part of that evidence is collected through when the stalker moves into cyber stalking behavior. And this becomes more difficult because, you know, it could be anonymous. Many times in our cases, there is cyber stalking where it is truly anonymous, but most of the time, you know, the victims know who that person is. You know, the stalkers will create fake Instagram accounts, fake Facebook accounts that, you know, based on the content of what they're posting, it's pretty clear who this person is. And through law enforcement tools, such as obtaining search warrants, we call them those, you know, there's many warrants that we can get where we could look at Instagram, we can get Facebook, we can get IP addresses, we could get the registration information that the stalker used to start the account. And more times than not, we're able to identify who started the account and prove that it was this stalker. Not always, but many times we can. Important to note though, and this blends in a bit to safety planning, is that, you know, because everyone uses social media, people love posting about where they are. They'll do selfies, they'll do check-ins, find my iPhone app. And because in the type of prior relationship that we deal with here in family protection, you know, they were dating. And so many times, depending on how long they were together and the level of closeness that they shared, passwords are shared or pretty easy to guess by the stalker. And so they're able to hack into iPhones, to Google, able to, through a fake social media, be able to follow that victim. And so it is important for the victim to take extra safety precautions when they have social media accounts.
And sometimes individuals think they're being safe by limiting what they're posting. But, you know, you have to be very careful. I recall, and this reminds me, I had recalled a victim that came in and we had asked her to take down her Facebook. And for a while she did, and then she started being stalked again. And when we met with her again, she had posted the photo of her outside her new residence, but she made sure that there was no address. Now, I didn't know where this person had moved to, but immediately looking at the photo, I immediately knew exactly where she lived just by looking at the photo. And I told her, you live in the city of Chula Vista between Hilltop and Montserrat, you know, and so I broke it down within a 4-block radius of where she lived. And she was amazed at how I knew that. And I knew that because I had worked in the city for so many years that I knew the flat roofs were only built in that particular area. So I recalled looking at that and she was amazed. So these are things that we have to be careful with. We think we're being safe by not, you know, making sure there's no address and, you know, out in front of the house, but we have to be cautious in regards to what we post. And so with the victims, I really ask them to just take everything down. No social media. Let's take it all down and let's start from scratch.
Another thing that is rather disturbing, and in cases that we see too, is the stalker may not make threats for the victim's safety. You know, they don't say, I'm going to kill you. They don't say, you know, you better watch your back, or, you know, there's no prior physical domestic violence in that relationship prior to ending it. But they will threaten to post explicit images. And many times these perpetrators do post explicit images, images that the victim, when, you know, he or she was with that stalker, when they were in that relationship, you know, they took consensually. And now this person's using it to threaten the victim and to assert the power and control that they've lost since the victim has left that relationship. And so, Oz and I get these cases too. And again, it's very fact by fact, very case specific, but they don't always rise to the level of stalking for that 646.9 penal code that governs stalking, but they may violate another law, and that is 647J4, and that governs posting those explicit images online. So, and then I put down the elements, the ingredients, if you will, of what we would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt to at least hold that person accountable for posting those explicit images. Sometimes we're able to prove stalking and this penal code as well. But when we can't prove stalking and they've still have posted these explicit images, we can at least try our best to hold them accountable through this penal code section. It is a misdemeanor crime, meaning that they will be subject to a fine, to a informal type probation, meaning that there wouldn't necessarily be a probation officer. Exceptions could always be made, but that's the default. And they could face up to 6 months for this particular penal code in jail. So misdemeanor, not so much teeth, but it's something.
Yeah, that's our biggest delay, our factor for delaying in any type of reports. The individual will receive this threat of, if you say something, I'm going to send this picture, and sometimes they'll send the picture to their best friend just as a warning. And they'll say, if you say something, I'll just post this on social media. And that immediately gets the victim to delay the reporting. So we see this quite often.
Yeah. Another great tool for the toolbox in investigating these cases, and also something that I like victims to know about too. I definitely tell my fellow prosecutors about this. It's it's a public website. It's our San Diego Superior Court website. On that website, with the link that is on this slide, you click that link. You are able to see whether there are other restraining orders out there. One, we could see if the victim filed a restraining order, but also see if anyone else has filed a restraining order against the same suspect. In some of the cases that Oz and I have worked on, we have seen where our current victim filed a restraining order, his ex-girlfriend filed a restraining order, his father filed a restraining order, and his landlord filed a restraining order. So if that doesn't scream pattern, I don't know what does. But it's an excellent tool. It's a public it's open for the public. Of course, as law enforcement, they have other special tools, but just even for the victim to kind of look and see themselves, that is one way the victim can look, but also just a great tool for all of you to know about as well.
Should be required for online dating sites.
Yes, I think it should be a prerequisite. We have been talking about the victim interview. We've been kind of weaving that in as we've been discussing, trying to investigate stalking cases. But we want to spend a little bit more time talking in detail about that victim interview. The victim interview is so important. I mean, really, the victim interview starts the moment they dial 911, right? The dispatcher gets basic information, officers arrive on scene. But as Oz had mentioned, when the suspect is already gone, and if it's a restraining order violation, for example, it's a misdemeanor, officers who are doing their best out there out in the field are responding to countless dispatch calls. So when the suspect is gone, the danger is then gone. They're going to take a quick report and then move on to clear another call. So you're not going to get too much information between the victim statement to that responding officer, not very much. Then it goes to a detective. Even then, ideally detectives definitely dig in deeper, but they're going through a bunch of cases too. And if that rapport isn't there, that victim may not feel even too comfortable opening up to this detective, on this phone call, And so with our office and in our team, we have our own separate interview with the victim. And ideally in person, definitely ideally in person. You just don't get that same connection with a victim over the phone. So ideally we'd like to meet in person. And Oz had mentioned this earlier, we use the term dig deep. That's really the best way we can describe it. We dig deep. These interviews at minimum are an hour, minimum. Oz, how long was your longest?
5 hours.
5. So, because we are going far and beyond the 4 corners of the police report we read. We're digging deep. We want to know the entire history, and I talked about this before, but understanding, why is this victim afraid? What has this suspect done? What were those red flags? Looking back now, everyone says hindsight is 20/20. What do you now see? What was that troubling behavior that you can now look back and realize, oh boy, those were some red flags. We want the victim to talk to us about that. During the course of that victim interview, Oz and I are also trying to see, as they're speaking to us, what corroboration can we find, And during this interview, as he or she is talking to us, we're like, oh, she mentioned phone calls. Maybe we can find through cell tower evidence that the suspect has been going to this house because she says he calls her every time before he comes over. Text messages, photographs, emails, witnesses, or the victims may be talking about, and then I told my mom and my sister about this. He's driven by my, family's house, and so then, Oz and I are going, okay, we need to interview family. So during the course of this victim interview, it could open a lot of doors to help us further investigate the case to hopefully get it to the point where we can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot when we're meeting with them to go through everything. And like Ramona said, a lot of things come out there. The list begins in regards to who we need to contact and possible witnesses. But sometimes once we meet with the victim, we don't have those ingredients. The chocolate chip are missing to make those chocolate chip cookies, right? And so we don't have that element. And from there, we have to, inform the person in front of us that we don't have the elements for this particular crime. And even then, we offer some additional information. But these interviews can be long, lengthy, detailed, and even though they've disclosed this information, we know when we have these, it's going to be us digging deep, and so we use that term quite a bit.
This is just more as far as, what we talk about in these interviews. Again, they're just so important. We have victims sometimes during our interview, and you hear about, for example, like a year long of this disturbing behavior, repeatedly following this victim, calling this victim, harassing this victim, and we're like, well, did you get a restraining order? No. Well, why not? Because a lot of times people just assume, well, if you're not going to get a restraining order, then you can't be that scared, right? Well, that's a really bad assumption to make. And so that's why these victim interviews are so important, because it gives that victim the opportunity to have a voice and be heard. And many times we'll hear, I didn't get a restraining order because I was afraid that it was going to really make him mad. And then that would be the straw that breaks the camel's back and I'd be dead. Or, a lot of times victims will hear, well, if he calls you all the time, why don't you just change your phone number? Like, easy fix, right? Wrong. So during this victim interview, we give the chance, we ask the victim, so why didn't you change your number? And make sure that we pose it in a way so they don't feel like we're judging them, because that's the last thing we're doing. What we're doing is giving them a platform to have their voice be heard so they can explain why, which most of the time it's because, well, I'd rather know when he is thinking of me, and he usually gives me that heads up that he's coming over so I can leave. Or I'd rather know when he's gotten to that point that he's so angry that I could change my location because now I know that he's out to find me. And so it's victims feel comfort in at least knowing that they're aware of where their stalker's state of mind is currently at.
Yeah, and I early on as a DV detective, a young DV detective, I was guilty of looking at these things and saying, well, you didn't get a restraining order, you didn't change your number, and you haven't changed your, profile. And so I was guilty of that. And the more I became involved in these cases and understanding, it made sense. Sometimes the TRO is not the right thing or the safest thing. I won't say the right thing, but the safest thing. And so we look at these avenues. But that's something for all my law enforcement friends out there that handle these cases or are new to these. Don't make that first assumption. I did, and I was wrong. And so I've learned throughout my career to not make that first judgment based off of these things.
I think that's so important to know. And the same thing goes for prosecutors too, which is why these trainings are just so important, is because, people have preconceived notions and people like to feel like, well, if I was in that situation, I would do A, B, and C. But frankly, you really just don't know what you would do until you're in that situation, until you're in that victim's shoes. And so again, another reason why these victim interviews are just crucial, regardless of what we do with the case. As Oz said, we won't necessarily have those chocolate chips. We may not be able to prove the stalking case, but you know what? The victim is feeling heard. The victim knows that there's a team out there that's ready to move forward. And at least we can work with safety planning for that victim. So at the end of the day, it's just so important. And a lot of times, not a lot of times, sometimes we have a situation where we could prove stalking, but then we discuss, is prosecution the best way to go about it? Every now and then, there is a situation where there is a stalker, but the stalking has ceased. The stalker has stopped, the victim got the restraining order, or for whatever reason, we may be able to prove it from, months, January through March. But really, since March through October, it's just been silent. We may decide that for safety reasons, it may not be the best thing to initiate criminal proceedings and then reignite that flame and reignite the anger the stalker once fueled when we're seeing that the stalker may have just moved on. So again, it's very convoluted, but that's part of the reason why we also have our stalking homicide prevention task force, which we'll also talk about in a moment. Again, this is just more of a continuation as to, what the questions that we ask the victim. And so again, we're digging deep, and we're specifically looking for when we don't have that direct threat of, I'm going to kill you. We're looking to see, was there an implied threat? And as Oz had mentioned, during, these victim interviews, he found out that the victim saying, he gave me this look, was enough to say it was an implied threat, because the look meant, I'm going to beat you up when you come home. So again, very important. Something we see a lot with our victims of stalking is that they've made significant changes to their lifestyle as a result of the stalker. Victims have moved. Some victims have changed their numbers. They've changed the way they live. They've purchased pepper spray to protect themselves because they're so scared. And these are just additional questions that are important to ask during the victim interview to help us be able to prove these stalking cases. So moving on from investigating stalking cases, let's say, here in California, we have a stalking case. We can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Our office initiates a criminal complaint, we move forward, and the stalker either pleaded guilty to stalking, or we went forward to jury trial and they were found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt by a jury. We are left with the sentencing for stalking, which we also want to discuss with you. if someone has been convicted of stalking, there are some options we have. One of those options, which I will say is the most common one that happens, is the stalker is placed on formal probation. Formal probation means that they are assigned to a probation officer. They will be on probation for a period of 3 years. We just had Assembly Bill 1950 pass. We were able to have stalking probation longer than that previously, but now we're limited to 3 years, monitored by probation. And I will say that San Diego County's high-risk stalking unit that probation has they're great. They're a team of dedicated probation officers who know how to monitor stalkers. So it's just a shout out to them. But they are placed on probation. During the course of probation, they will have to do 1 year of stalking counseling. That is a default. The court would have to find and articulate good cause, meaning a pretty good, very good reason why this person should not do counseling, but it would require more times than not 1 year of stalking counseling, and they would have to go once a week for that counseling session. Many times what we do is we have the stalker placed on GPS monitoring. This is live monitoring by probation, so that if the stalker even comes close to and I call it the no-no areas, the probation officer will contact the victim, get the victim's address, keeping all of this information confidential, of course, from the stalker. Her address, maybe the church she goes to, the school she attends, where she works, the places that the victim frequents the most. And we'll make sure that that GPS starts alarming if the defendant, the convicted stalker, goes even close to those areas. And that has happened actually this year in one of my cases. And I will tell you, they acted so quickly and it was great. The victim was immediately notified, probation was on it. They worked with other law enforcement partners and they were able to capture that stalking defendant. And even when a defendant is placed on probation, there's still prison time hanging over the defendant's head during the course of probation, because probation is a privilege. It's giving this person a chance to rehabilitate, to stay away from the victim. It's a huge, don't do this because we mean business. You've now been convicted, you are a felon, and there is prison time hanging over your head if you mess up. And so they still could potentially go to prison if they violate probation. Now, that is an option we use a lot. We will have a stalking defendant do a certain amount of time in jail. We can have them placed in jail for up to a year, and then they'll be released on GPS monitoring supervised by probation. Another option is them going straight to prison. And in California, the prison time for stalking, and again, I'm just focusing on just stalking, not if it was coupled with any other charges, because that would be different. But just for stalking, it's called low term. So the lowest prison time that you would get for stalking is 16 months. And the most you could get is 5 years. And that 5-year number means that you were previously convicted of stalking, or you were previously convicted of felony DV or felony threats. So you have to have some type of criminal history to elevate you to those 5 years. So that's really max. And regardless if you are sentenced to prison or probation, we can request a restraining order. We call those criminal protective orders when they're issued by a criminal court for up to 10 years. Usually we just ask for 10 years. We ask for the max, and the court never hesitates. I mean, I haven't had a situation where the court has hesitated to give a 10-year protective order when it comes to a stalking case. The great thing about that too is it also requires firearm relinquishment, which is great. Sex registration. some of these stalking cases are intertwined with sex assaults. I mean, that could be the threat. There could be prior history with sex assaults during the course of the relationship prior to breaking up. So depending on the case, we may ask for the defendant to register as a sex offender. Some things to note about stalking laws in California that I think is important to understand. It's not considered a strike. You may have heard in California, as most of us have, that some offenses are considered what we call a strike, meaning that it would require a result of which, if you should commit another crime, depending on you could face double time. So where the max you could get would be 5 years, it could be 10 years. It would just be times 2, it doubles. But it's not a strike. So there isn't that heavy hammer that you may have for other charges. Another thing that stalking is not, because it's not a strike, you only serve, if you do go to prison, at most, and I'm going to say at most, is going to be 50% of that time. So if you were sentenced to 16 months, you do 50% of that. You were sentenced to 4 years, you do 2 years, maybe even less. So not too much of a hammer there. And so the reason why we do a lot of our cases as probation is because we don't have a lot of teeth. We send someone who has no criminal history, maybe the court will sentence them to 2 years, 3 years, maybe, let's just say even 5 years max. And that's because this person has a record of stalking or domestic violence. They serve at most 2.5 years in prison. And then they get out on parole, which is just not what it used to be because of funding. And they're essentially just out, and that's very scary for the victim. So many times, even victims, they would love to have a heavier hammer and have this person in custody for as long as possible, because when a stalker is in custody, that means the victim feels safe. They finally get peace of mind when that person is in custody, but they're not going to be in it for very long. And so because of that, we do this probation, this type of, I call it a short leash probation, where they are being monitored on GPS, they're being supervised by a probation officer, they're required to go into counseling to hopefully rehabilitate, but then there's still that hammer that they could go to prison if they violate. So that's a big reason, a lot of why we do probation, just because you're not going to serve a lot of time in prison. And so, we have a situation where stalking isn't very easy to prove. Legally, it's not what most people think it is, right? Going back to those elements, the ingredients to make that chocolate chip cookie, we don't always have it. And even so, it's difficult to prove as is, because we have to have that credible threat. But even in cases when we can prove it, it's not a very heavy hammer. And that's where we are right now in California. I've been working with another member in the DV Council. Oz and I have been talking about it, and through this, person's research on her own, she found out in another state, stalking laws, you can go up to prison for 20 years, up to 20 years. And considering the statistics in stalking, how often people are stalked, the fact that approximately 50% of our domestic violence homicides was preceded by stalking behavior, we don't have a lot of teeth here. We just don't. And so, we have been working with members of the DV Council. Oz and I have we're ready to join a team and help form a team that, if you're interested in seeing laws change when it comes to stalking, we are too. So, we're going to answer any questions that you may have at the end of this training, but please reach out to us if you are interested in helping us change the law, because I think it's time. And at minimum, to at least be where some other states are. The last thing that we wanted to talk about that's very important is victim advocacy and victim safety planning. On our team, our Stalking Homicide Task Force, which has Oz as our lead investigator, me as the lead prosecutor, DA to it. We also have a designated paralegal and a designated victim advocate. And they are specially trained in threat assessment. All of our victim advocates are, but we do have one that's specific for stalking. We also have a high-risk team that I'm fairly certain most of you are aware of, but if not, our office also works with other community partners in addressing high-risk cases where regardless of whether we move forward with prosecution, we know that this victim is at heightened risk. And so victim advocacy is very important. Our victim advocates work very closely with the stalking victim, regardless of whether we can prove the case or not, regardless of whether we file charges, and works with the victim in potential relocations, counseling, and the state helps provide for reimbursement to help the victim get a decent surveillance system so that they can have more peace of mind as well. Another important thing that we tell victims is about victim services on the sheriff's website. There is a what we call Vine. And what that does is when a suspect is in custody, defendant's in custody, it will notify the victim should the suspect, defendant post bond or whenever they're released. So we tell victims to sign up on Vine, and so that they can get notified in the event that their stalker is released from jail. And one thing, again, as far as safety tips are concerned, that we tell our victims, and again, there will be times where, as Oz said, the victim will have contact with the stalker. It's usually at the point of true frustration of just leave me alone. But we do advise our victims not to have contact with their stalker, to tell family, friends, neighbors, coworkers about what's happening so that they can be eyes behind their heads as well, to show people photos of their stalker, to tell, again, coworkers, bosses, this is the make, model of the stalker's car, so that everyone can, again, we're all working as a team here to protect this victim, to change their regular routine. Victims get frustrated because it's like, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. Why should I change my life? And it's very frustrating and it is not fair. But for safety purposes, it's important to change their routine, not to answer the phone unless they know who's calling, to get that restraining order, change their locks, get a surveillance system. Again, things that our victim services can help with monetarily. If they have a garage, keep their car in it. A lot of times stalkers like to vandalize the victim's property and to always keep their cell phone handy. One thing that Oz and I tell victims is don't second guess your gut feeling. If you feel the hairs in the back of your neck stand up, have a bad gut feeling, do what you do to stay safe. Dial 911. That's okay. That's what police are for. Even if nothing comes from it, just do what you need to do to protect yourself. And Claudia had talked to you about it, and Oz and I have alluded to it as well, but Oz and I are part of the Stalking Homicide Prevention Task Force here at the District Attorney's Office. What we do is we have monthly meetings and roundtables. We open those roundtables up to our community partners, to the City Attorney's Office, our law enforcement agencies county-wide, and they bring potential stalking cases that they have that they're investigating to the table, perhaps a stalking case that's already been issued, and we talk about strategy and improving the case, and we talk about victim safety planning. So it's with our whole team. The team right now, it's me, it's Oz, Carrie Duncan is our stalking victim advocate. It was Yadira Diaz before her, and a paralegal Angela Fagundes Williams, who's also specially trained in threat assessment. Again, we go over stalking cases. We're happy to meet with you to talk to you about investigating those stalking cases, putting strong emphasis on victim safety planning, and answer any questions that anyone may have. Again, our goal is to prevent the next murder. And that is the end of our presentation.
Thank you so much. We do have several questions from participants, and let me kind of batch a few questions. From Mayola Miranda, there were a few questions regarding laws. So please cover the new laws regarding coercive control. And then other states don't require credible threat element and prosecute under the first element of repeated harassing, following, etc. Many stalkers learn to toe the line to not get arrested by not making the direct threat.
Amelia, I'm so sorry. So their computer shut off. So they're now in my office. Could you please repeat the question? They're here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there were two parts to this question. I'm batching some of the questions. So from Mayola Miranda, the first question is, please cover the new laws regarding coercive control. And then part two, other states don't require credible threat element and prosecute under the first element of repeated harassing following. Many stalkers learn to toe the line to not get arrested by not making the direct threat.
Let me turn on the video. Hi, everyone. Okay, so the first part of the question, as far as the laws concerning coercive control, there are no laws that define or cover coercive control. So there isn't anything in the books that defines that. As for the second part of the question, it was lengthy, so I missed part of it. But Amelia, would you mind?
Some others.
Okay. When there's not a credible threat element, the stalkers learn not to get arrested by not making a direct threat. Can you address that?
Yeah, and that's very frustrating here. That's part of the thing that we were talking about. You know, stalking laws are different throughout our nation and across the states. And here in California, we do require a credible threat. And because of that, and that's what Oz and I were trying to explain, is that we hit a roadblock because these stalkers, and this person who's posing this question, you're right on. They're smart, you know, and they do almost everything short of making that credible threat. And that is just, it's very frustrating for the victims. It's very frustrating for us as prosecutors and frustrating for law enforcement officers because it feels like they're getting away with it, and they kind of are. So that's why Oz and I talk about having that victim interview, because what we're doing and what our goal is to see if we can prove an applied threat. And it's through spending that time with the victim. Again, Oz said the most he's done was 5 hours. That's a long time. The minimum I've ever done is 1 hour. I will say the average is at least 2 hours, where we're trying to get as much information as we can to see if we can show that there is an applied threat under the law so that we can ethically move forward with a stalking case. But here in California, we do require a credible threat. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, and there was a clarification. The person was asking about the SB 1141 domestic violence coercive control passed last year. I believe that had to do with restraining orders and being able to include coercive control under the definition of domestic abuse. Claudia, you were familiar with that?
Yes, I am. And I'm like peeking over here. So in essence, what the legislature did was to add coercive control to the definition of domestic violence. And so originally domestic violence included just that, violence. but the legislature recognized that domestic abuse really is an umbrella that encompasses violence and psychological abuse and emotional abuse and, of course, financial abuse. And so what the legislature did, recognizing that, was to add the word coercive control to encompass the psychological abuse, which are in essence threats, to the definition of domestic violence in terms of restraining orders. Unfortunately, we still don't have that in our definition in the penal code for the criminal code. So that's that.
Okay, we have actually lots of questions, so I'll try to go through them as quickly as possible. There was a frustration that this is what makes it difficult for victims to get restraining orders. Not all abuse is physical. It's very difficult to even obtain a restraining order. And then discussing the idea of affidavits and going to court, it's re-traumatizing.
I agree. I absolutely agree. And I think Oz and I were talking about that too. It's such a big process to file legal paperwork, go to court, take time out of your day. It's like the stalker isn't controlling you enough. Now you have to react and take all of these steps just to protect yourself, you know? And then you feel like you're not even being heard, because then when you call the police, you feel like nothing's being done. And so that's why Oz and I wanted to spend some time to talk about and recognize and acknowledge that victims are frustrated, and they are righteously frustrated. And so, and it's not because, you know, police aren't doing what they're supposed to do. They're doing all they can do with what they have. And so these smart stalkers, they leave the scene before police arrive. Police will do a cursory search, but that's all they can do at that time. The detective will get the case and do the best the detective can do. And that's why we have the task force that we do have, because we want to spend time with those victims and work with our law enforcement partners to see if we can build a stalking case. But I hear you, to whoever was asking that question and making that comment, and we hear you and we agree. It is very frustrating, but that's why it's our goal in our office to give the victim a platform to be heard and realize we're hearing you, we're listening to you, and we're trying our best to see what we can do. And if we can prosecute this stalking case ethically, because it meets those elements, we will absolutely do so if it's the right thing to do. But at minimum, we hear you, and we're going to do our best to also safety plan with you.
Okay, the next question, is there a public-facing database for the entire state of California to check prior restraining orders in other counties?
That is a great question that I do not have an answer to. I would imagine, because and we had talked about the San Diego Superior Court website having this public access to see if there's restraining orders that have been filed. I may assume that other counties will have something very similar. I know that just in my experience, I've been able to go on different counties in California to pull to see if there was other type of criminal filings, if I can't initially access that, you know, through other means. But there may be, but I don't know for sure if there is. I would assume there's something similar in San Diego as there is in San Diego, but don't know for sure.
And maybe what we can do is, if there's additional information when we post the recording with the edited closed captioning, maybe we can share some of these resources. And I believe that's going to be in about 2 weeks.
Right.
The next point that actually somebody asked was, are there any protections or tips for victims who have children with their stalkers?
Protection tips for victims with children. One thing that I will say, and that we have told victims who do have children, and this is a lot of times when the stalker is the father of these children too, but not necessarily, but a lot of times when they are, we tell our victims to inform the school that there is because many times there'll be a restraining order in place, that there is a restraining order in place. And many times, great. Notify the school staff that this person is on the no pickup list, that there is a restraining order in place, to speak with their children. You know, if this is something, I mean, obviously it's going to depend on the children's age and the victim's comfort level on, you know, what they want to communicate to their children, but to safety plan with their children as well. But the more people that know in the victim's circle about what's going on, and the more people that know in their children's circle about what's going on, everyone works together to protect them.
Thank you. And then I wanted to make a note regarding one of the links that you posted, that the Sheriff's Department changed their website for victims. And I'll post the new website. It's now sdsheriff.gov/resources/victim-services.
Great.
So please note that the link that you had on your PowerPoint doesn't work anymore. So this is the new site.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. We'll have to update that too.
Absolutely. And then one more question. The fact of language barrier makes victims vulnerable and prevents being able to file restraining orders. So just the issue of language.
So many courts actually have individuals that can assist with that. So depending on which court it is and the language, but there are individuals that can help fill out paperwork. They just have to look for those resources at the courthouse. I don't know what languages are covered, but I am aware that there are some different individuals that speak different languages that actually assist in filling out the entire paperwork.
Absolutely. So please don't let that be a discouragement. That there are people out there and interpreters and court certified interpreters that are out there that can help victims assist in that as well.
Okay, I think that is, there are no more questions in the chat.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll give it back to Claudia.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this very important presentation. Next up in August, we have a presentation on elder abuse. As many of you know, this is a systemic problem that is happening. And yes, technically that's not domestic violence, but elder abuse within families is growing exponentially. And of course, we also see the elder abuse that's happening in terms of scams, in terms of just those vulnerable people that are being preyed upon every day. And elderly is a population that is growing and growing. And pretty soon, in a few decades, there are going to be more elderly people than young people. And so we definitely have to protect our elderly. And so we are inviting Scott Perillo, who's also Deputy District Attorney who heads up the elder abuse unit here in the DA's office, but he also has just formed the first task force in conjunction with the FBI and other community partners and law enforcement throughout San Diego to go after those scammers and go after all those, vulnerable people that are being preyed upon every day. So please, please, please join us. Remember, it is the third Tuesday of the month. So that will be the 17th of August. Also, don't forget that on August 11th, we have our DV Essentials. That is the day-long training covering various facets of domestic violence. And you get your certificate of completion at the end of it. And I believe 500 is our cap. And I believe we reached that last time for registration. So please, please, please register. I've sent the email out with the link, but also it should be posted on our website, and we'll keep putting it in our social media as well if you want to register. And that will take place on August 11th, which is a Wednesday. Thank you so much for your encouragement, your support, for joining us. And again, I am Claudia Grasso. I am here. If you need anything, please feel free to email me, contact me. and join us at the DV Council for our various presentations and events. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.